Hi everybody, welcome to the second webinar of our fall webinar series. My name is Zoe Little and I'm a campus coordinator with Students for Liberty. Before we get started with this awesome webinar by Cathy Reisenwitz, I wanted to show you a few really cool things that are happening with SFL at the moment and show you around the website a little bit and let you know what we've got going on. First, the 2014-2015 campus coordinator early applications are still open. We have extended the deadline due to overwhelming excitement over the application process and over the campus coordinator positions. If you're a student and you're interested in getting more involved in the student movement for liberty and getting some awesome leadership training, I highly recommend that you apply for this program. It's been an excellent improvement in my life, and I think it could really make a difference on your campus if you are interested in promoting the ideas of liberty. Second, our regional conference season is over, but the International Students for Liberty Conference is coming up this February. You can you can sign up for the conference here. It's going to be awesome. We're going to have tons of people up in DC, and it is an excellent opportunity for anyone who can attend. Next on our calendar is the Liberty Fund Symposia, which is in March. Basically what that is a 3-day-long intensive discussion with 15 people and a professor on this topic related to liberty. The application process is competitive. It's limited to a small group of students, but Students for Liberty will provide your housing, meals, and materials. And I've heard from everyone who's attended one of these symposia that it's an incredible opportunity and you will learn a ton. Finally, if you want to keep track of the webinar series, you can find it here. You can also view past webinars here and see what's coming up. I can tell you our next webinar is going to be with a fan favorite, Jeffrey Tucker, on December 11th. So keep an eye out for the registration for that. Without further ado, I will introduce our wonderful guest, Cathy Reisenwitz, pardon me. Cathy is a Young Voices associate and a DC-based writer and political commentator. She is editor-in-chief of Sex and the State, which is right here. And her writing has appeared in Forbes, the Chicago Tribune, Reason Magazine, Talking Points Memo, the Washington Examiner, the Daily Caller, XOJane, the Freeman, the Individualist, Feminist, and Penelope Trunk's Brazen, Careerist. Cathy is one of my favorite figures in the liberty movement, and I would like all of you to give her a silent webinar applause for her presentation. Cathy, I'll turn it over to you.
Zoe, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you so much, Ankur, for having us on. I want to thank Students for Liberty for entertaining this topic. I know that it's a little bit controversial in these circles, so it's really awesome that we're having this conversation. So today I'm going to talk to you about libertarian feminism, what it means, how it can be helpful in winning more women over to liberty, and making the moral case for why that's important. So I want to start out this talk talking about a recent book by AEI President Arthur Brooks called The Road to Freedom. And in this book, Arthur Brooks makes the case that winning people over to liberty requires making the moral case for it. That's kind of the inspiration for my talk. So what that means in practical terms is that all the charts in the world will never sway someone who doesn't believe that you have good intentions. So kind of the kitschy saying for this is, people don't know how much you know, don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And as kind of cheesy as that is, I, as a marketer and somebody who's been really interested in why people make the decisions that they make, I think that it holds true. So Brooks is digging deep into what it will take for free marketers to establish themselves as moral people. So to figure that out, he looks to moral philosopher Jonathan Haidt, who made a name for himself with some of the most wide and in-depth surveys of self-described libertarians that have ever been conducted. And what he found is that on average, libertarians make decisions less empathetically and more rationally than other people. And so that's really interesting and gives us some insight into kind of where some of our problems are going to be in relating to other people and establishing ourselves as moral people. So to figure out how we can do so, Haidt surveys Americans to find out which morals most Americans share. And what he finds are 3 traits that nearly all Americans define as morally right. Among them is what he calls care harm. And so to quote him, this foundation is related to our long evolution as mammals with attachment systems and an ability to feel and dislike the pain of others. It underlies virtues of kindness, gentleness, and nurturance. So what this means practically is that people in general find it morally right for the strong to protect and help the weak. So throughout history, and enduring until the present day, women have been oppressed by men and other women. And while at no other time in history have women been as free from institutionalized and outright sexism as they are today, sexism unfortunately endures in our society. I'm going to say something kind of controversial here, but I want you to hear me out. The answer to sexism is feminism. So what I want you to do for a second is kind of put aside all of your negative conceptions of feminism, all the baggage that you have with that word, and open up your mind to a very simple but I think powerful definition of what I mean by feminism. So feminism at its core, I believe, means only 3 things. It means first, believing that sexism is a real and enduring problem. Second, it means believing sexism negatively affects both men and women. And third, it means sexism deserves a response. So everything I think in addition to that, all of the proposed solutions to sexism, even a lot of the theorized sources of sexism, those are on top, right? Those are in addition. But the core of feminism, I think, are those 3 things. Sexism is a real and enduring problem. It affects both men and women negatively, and it deserves a response. So I think that the fact that people believe different things about feminism, that people attach a lot of different ideas to feminism, is the result of an effort by the left to co-opt the righteous goals of feminism to further their status ends. And it's a result of the right's effort to blame feminism for their ongoing defeat in the so-called culture wars. So I'm going to go further into what I mean by that in my talk, but I think that's a lot of the problem that people have with feminism. But it's also a huge opportunity for us because neither the left nor the right really get feminism. And because by failing to do so, they're actually harming women. That means that libertarians have an excellent opportunity to fight sexism, and by doing so establish ourselves as moral people, and we can do it without compromising our small government, individual liberty, human flourishing goals. So before I get into that, I'm going to kind of do a little background into liberty's woman problem. So first let's talk about how libertarianism is currently made up. Nearly all libertarians, 94%, are non-Hispanic whites, and more than 2/3, 68%, are men. This is interesting, especially to SFL's crowd. 6 in 10 are under the age of 50. So we're very young, we're a very white, and we're a very male movement right now. I believe that that's because 2 things. First, it's a result of fusionism, and then I think it's a result of kind of economic issues and, for example, taxes as opposed to social issues. And I think part of the reason for that and problem with that, we need to look at married and single women. So it might surprise you that the political split between married and single women is greater than the split between men and women. Cathy Reisenwitz explained in City Journal, the gap between married and single women is wider than the male-female gap that the media have been touting. And it's not new. Married women have voted Republican in nearly every presidential election since 1980, with the one exception of 1996 when they preferred Bill Clinton by 4 percentage points. Unmarried women, however, tend to vote Democratic. So it's, I don't know if you guys are aware, I'm sure you've seen trend pieces about where marriage is going, but 2 years ago, marriage rates fell below 50% for the first time in history, and they're continuing to drop. So if we're looking at our alliance between the right, who the ideology which tends to appeal to married women, it's important to note that that's a smaller and smaller percentage of women. And so if we're not appealing to single women, we're going to have problems reaching out to women at all going forward. So I think we need to be thinking about how we're going to possibly capture the heart and minds of unmarried women. So to look at how the right has failed to reach the hearts and minds of single women, I think we need to look at kind of the issues with fusionism. So fusionism, if you guys aren't familiar, it's the broad agreement between libertarians and conservatives to work together in the areas on which they agree. And the result of fusionism is that people often much more closely associate libertarianism with conservatism than liberalism. So single women looking at libertarianism think Rush Limbaugh, Republicans, low taxes. They don't think people who care about my issues, things that affect me specifically. And one of the biggest issues is that when we associate ourselves and align ourselves with conservatives, we're associating ourselves with conservative subtle and not so subtle sexism. So for a very, very recent example from this week, conservative commentator, probably the most famous conservative commentator, Rush Limbaugh, recently referred to single mothers as receptacles for male semen. So my first question to Rush is there another kind of semen? But also, unfortunately, this is kind of a trend in the conservative sphere to hate on single mothers, who, again, are becoming a larger and larger percentage of the population. And I think more babies are born to unwed mothers than wed mothers at this point. And it's a larger and larger percentage of the population. So for a personal example, I sat on a panel about female breadwinners a few months ago, and the moderator took a jab at media coverage of single mothers, saying that she doesn't appreciate how they're portrayed as heroic. So I began my portion of the talk mentioning that I was raised by a heroic single mother. So you can see how that can kind of alienate a percentage of our population that we might actually want to win over to liberty. Another common trope in conservative circles is that feminism is to blame for the decline of marriage. But what's interesting to note about that is that marriage has only declined among low-income people. I'm not really sure why feminist rhetoric about marriage would only impact low-income people's marriage behavior. So what's interesting to note is if you look at economic trends over the same period of time, so right as feminism was kind of entering the general consciousness around the 1970s, manufacturing in this country began to move overseas, and the economy began shifting from manufacturing and agriculture-based economy to an information and service-based economy. So where once a man could support a family with a high school education, today's low-skilled jobs favor women. Women tend to do better in the service sector. And women are continually outnumbering men in higher education, which is necessary for an information-based job. So it would look like if you actually applied critical thinking, the shift away from marriage in the lower incomes was not so much cultural. It's not so much a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle, but it's economic. You can't support a family on a single income if the primary wage earner only has a high school degree anymore. So beyond that, the right is constantly accusing feminine of being pro-state, anti-male, anti-sex, and no longer necessary. And to their credit, a lot of feminism is all of those things. But the issue is that those are legitimate criticisms of certain schools of feminism. They're not legitimate criticism of feminism as an ideology. And the solutions that the right pose are not sufficient to deal with the problem of sexism, unfortunately. I think what really undergirds this tension between feminism and female equality and the right is that a lot of conservatives see tremendous value in what they call the traditional family. And so what I believe they mean by this is a 1950s version of a wife who stays home and raises children and a man who works to support them. Now, to call this traditional is kind of a stretch, as this conception is, historically speaking, pretty recent. But despite conservatives' desire to see it maintained, American society is simply moving away from this model. Most mothers work, good or bad. More and more mothers are unmarried, and more people are delaying and foregoing marriage entirely. So if we continue to fight against people who are abandoning this model, and we continue to say that they're responsible for all of society's ills, and we continue to blame women for these economic and cultural and sociological changes, we're just going to lose those women. We're not going to change the tides of economics. We're just going to alienate ourselves from the younger generation. So I think that's a huge problem and something that we need to take very seriously. So what the right has kind of tried to do to try to fight these trends is promote the idea that a woman's place is in the home with her children, supported by her husband. To get a very recent iteration of this idea, we can look to Suzanne Hoff-Sommer's recent book, where she lays out which spheres women are naturally suited to and why they're naturally suited to them. Before that, right-wing pundit Suzanne Benker wrote about how today's low-skill men are unmoored because women keep trying to escape their natural roles and assume the roles of men. So she doesn't talk about the change in our economy from an information-based, from an agriculture and manufacturing-based economy to an information and service-based economy. She doesn't talk about how, labor regulations make it more difficult to earn a living. None of that. It's women. Women are getting too full of themselves and trying to take the place of men, and they just need to sit down, shut up, go home, and everything will be fine. It's kind of problematic. So, I mean, I think if you look at these messages, it should be obvious to you why telling women what roles they're naturally suited to would limit their ambitions and choices. So if conservatives were successful, which they've not been, but if they were, and to the extent that they have been, they disincentivize women from trying to succeed in the working world because they're told their gender limits their natural ability, and because they're told that if they do try and they do succeed, that success makes them less feminine. And so to get a kind of idea of how this works, you can look at a study which asked two groups of girls to take a math test. So one group of girls was reminded of the stereotype that girls are worse than boys at math, and the other group was just given the test. And as you would expect, the girls who received the message that they're going to do poorly did more poorly than the girls who didn't. So this idea that women have natural spheres and that they have a natural place that they want to be, it's not benign, it's pernicious, and it has very real effects. And its goal at preserving this idea of gender roles that America used to have is not going to work, but it's just going to harm women in the meantime. Now, of course, no one can credibly claim that there are no biological differences between men and women. But looking at gender roles and teasing out the impact gendered expectations have on women's choices and performance is important. Gendered expectations, like those presented by right-wing pundits like Hoff-Sommers and Benker, they do hurt women by making it more difficult for them to exceed outside of their predetermined roles. And it's not just a problem with Benker and Hoff-Sommers. I think we're still living in a society that expects different things of women than men, even outside of the left-right paradigm. So I like to tell this story, and I apologize for those who have heard it before, that I used to be married, and when I was married, I worked a full-time job in technology, actually, and my husband worked part-time jobs. And but when people would come over to our home or ask us about our home life, they would never ask him, they would never ask him about the cleanliness of our home. They would never ask him where he does the grocery shopping or how often he cooks. All of those questions would go to me. And so there was an idea that I was expected to do those things, and that if I weren't doing those things, that I was somehow failing as a woman and as a wife. And so I had the choice that I could either fail to meet those expectations and deal with the consequences, or take time away from my job and my career and my hobbies to meet those expectations. And so when we look at the fact that women seem to be choosing they're working fewer hours, and they're taking jobs that require less education and less responsibility and less time, we have to think about how the expectation that they will also be excelling in the home, and they will also be responsible for the majority of the child care, and they will also be responsible for caring for aging parents, impacts their choices, because no one makes choices in a vacuum. And so these expectations and this culture that people live in and these gendered expectations, they have effect on the choices that women make. So I want to talk now about what's the solution to this. You know, we're all pretty familiar with how the left is missing the boat with their state solutions, which limit freedom and aren't particularly effective and have unintended consequences. I've kind of tried to lay out some of the problems with the way the right is dealing with feminism. So how should libertarians deal with sexism and address feminism? So I'd first say, denying sexism exists will never sway people who know that it's real. So when we're talking to single mothers, when we're talking to unmarried women, women who are trying to make it in the world in a career, women who have experienced sexism in their daily lives, if we sit there and say, well, you know, sex, it's not really a problem, it's overblown, you know, I just don't believe in it, we're just going to lose them. Like they're just not listening at that point. And so I think one of the hugest things that we can do is to recognize that many libertarians have never experienced outright sexism against women, either because we're 68% male or because of the non-male among us, we're pretty privileged. A lot of women in the liberty movement, they tell me, you know, sexism has never held me back. But it's important to note that in this day and age, at the higher levels of income and education, most people who discriminate against women are smart enough not to admit it publicly. So while you may have never been told that you didn't get invited to that club or chosen for that job or accepted by that mentor, that it was because you're a woman, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. It only means that you'll never know about it. But for many more women, especially at the lower levels of income and education, sexism has been a problem in their lives. So it's really important to, and I'm going to say another really loaded phrase that I want to go into, and hopefully you're going to understand better when I'm done, we need to learn to check our privilege. So a lot of people, like with feminism, have come to ignorantly come to misuse and resent the idea of checking our privilege. But really, again, like with feminism, it's a really simple idea. Checking your privilege means there are problems that other people experience that you don't know exist because who you are insulates you from them. I'm going to say that again. There are problems other people experience that you don't know about because who you are insulates you from them. So what does that mean? So the word privilege in this context is actually kind of a misnomer. Privilege in this context actually means something like sheltered. So to be privileged means to be sheltered. So what that means is it's just a fact that if you're a man, you are sheltered against sexism aimed at women, right? If you're a white person, you are sheltered against racism aimed at racial minorities. And the same goes for being cisgendered, for being straight, for being rich, whatever kind of discrimination there is. If you're not of that category, you're not getting it. So what becoming aware of the fact of privilege does for you is it can help you listen when people tell you about their experiences. And the other thing that it can do is if you acknowledge that you're aware of the limitations of your knowledge, if you make it clear that you're aware of that, people feel like you're listening to them. So I want to make it very clear that having a usually privileged identity, such as male, such as white, such as cisgender, such as straight, such as wealthy, well-educated, it doesn't mean that you're totally ignorant of other experiences. And it doesn't mean that you have nothing of value to contribute to a conversation. But it means that on issues of other experiences, you have more to learn and less to teach than someone who's lived those experiences. Right, so if you're a man, it's not that you don't know anything about sexism. It's not that you can't speak intelligently and eloquently on sexism. What it means is, if a woman is speaking about her experiences, you can learn from that, right? Because she's experienced things that you can't. So being aware of that and acknowledging it can make you a much better ally to her and frankly, help you get more out of that conversation and help her feel listened to than otherwise. So check and privilege, it's not complicated. It's just acknowledge it, listen accordingly, and then make your point. So another thing that we can do as libertarians to have conversations about people and to kind of to address sexism is to understand that, well, of course, certain masculine and feminine traits have biological bases as opposed to cultural bases. We need to understand that figuring out which is which is a task for empirical research. We don't know a lot of these things. We don't know a lot of these issues. And so what we can do is say, I don't know what which is which right now, but I understand that if I believe that these things have biological bases, which I don't have empirical bases for, that has negative ramifications. And so the more we can think critically about, oh, well, maybe it's possible that women choose lower wage careers because they feel pressure to perform at home, and that if we helped women feel less pressured at home to do all these other tasks, that they would feel empowered to seek high power careers and they would earn the same as men. Maybe, we don't know, but it's worth thinking about, and it's worth thinking critically about, and it's worth pushing back on these gendered expectations that we don't know have biological bases. The other thing we can do as libertarians is, another really kind of controversial term within the gender relations realm is rape culture, right? And so a lot of rape culture is really state-based. So for example, I was speaking to a small group of college students, and it was like 7 people, and 2 of the girls in my group were themselves victims of sexual assault. And one of them told me that she was called by her friend who had just been raped to help out, and she arrived at the scene, and there was a police officer there and a paramedic there, and the paramedic was trying to take her to the hospital so they could do a rape kit on her, and the police officer was yelling at the rape victim, "What did you do wrong?" and telling the paramedic to not take her away because he didn't believe her. And he was actively trying to avoid having to process this rape kit and investigate this crime. And so as libertarians, we should be looking at that and saying, you know, obviously there are huge problems with the way we deal with crime in this country in general, but it is completely unacceptable for the people that we've entrusted to serve and protect us to further victimize women when they are victims of violent crime, right? So that doesn't take any more state intervention. That's just being libertarians and saying, you have a job to do, you need to do it. And so that's a huge thing that we can do. We can look at the fact that police departments are letting rape kits expire by the thousands every year, completely untested, because they're too busy prosecuting the war on drugs to protect women from their rapists. And we can put pressure on them and keep them accountable for testing these rape kits. And so these are some things that we can do. The last thing that we can do that I think would be extremely helpful is just to make the issues which affect women a priority. So 2 examples, just real quick, are affordable daycare and immigration. So affordable daycare and an opening up immigration, which would obviously make it much easier for women to find domestic help so that they can fulfill their duties and obligations in the home and maintain careers, would do so much to practically help women on the ground and expand their options to them. So it's not telling anyone, you know, you should do this or you should do that. Both of these are completely cooperative. A lot of the problems with daycare have to do with licensure, have to do with unnecessary regulations. And so we're actually shrinking the state, right? And we're actually accomplishing libertarian goals by fighting for affordable daycare and for you know, opposing immigration restrictions. We're helping women at the same time. And so if we just make it clear that this is a priority to us, we want to help women. We're interested in the issues which predominantly affect women, and we want to make their lives easier. We want to make them victims of sexism less often. and we want to widen their available choices to them in a totally cooperative manner. I think that would be extremely helpful. And so I want to challenge libertarians to take seriously the issues that affect women, I really want to challenge us to put our thinking, our critical thinking, our scholarship, our blog post writing, our activism, all the things that we're doing to lower taxes and to open borders and to fight for civil liberties, and put some of that energy and enthusiasm to the issues affecting women as well. It does not need to be, and in fact it should not be state-based, it should not be coercive, it should all be cooperative, but it needs to be a priority, and we need to take it seriously. Or we're going to continue to lose women, especially single women, to the people who are taking it seriously, to the people who are making it a priority. Barack Obama beat Mitt Romney way just head and shoulders among single women, because the right is just either openly hostile or ignoring women, and that's to their detriment. So I would love to see libertarians fill in that breach. So that's about all I had to say. I would like to open it to questions if you guys have any. And again, thank you so much, Zoe, for introducing me, SFL for having me. I really enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of this.
Thank you so much, Cathy. If you guys have any questions, there should be a question box on the side of your webinar panel. In the meantime, Cathy, I really enjoyed your talk. I really appreciate that you brought up that no one makes choices in a vacuum, but that every decision everyone makes has some sort of cultural and social pressures on them. We have a first question from, I'm sorry if I pronounce your name improperly, Egel? Mark, not even going to try. Could you please recommend good literature on some individual libertarian feminism?
Oh, thank you. Absolutely. So I think a really great place to start would be a Facebook group, actually. There is a Facebook group called the Association of Libertarian Feminists, and it's headed by a woman named Sharon Presley, and they're actually coming out with an anthology pretty soon of libertarian feminist thinkers and really important essays in the movement. So they've got the Facebook page, and they've got a newsletter too that you can subscribe to, and it kind of pulls together the best of the contemporary literature and writing in the libertarian feminist sphere. Wendy McElroy is a good source. I am a huge fan of, I can't believe I'm forgetting her name, but she works for anti-war. Angela Keaton. Angela Keaton is a really awesome person to follow now. As far as some older stuff, I'm not as familiar, but those are some really good places to start. I'm sure that if you contacted Sharon Presley, she would give you a great list of kind of fundamental text to start with.
Great, thank you, Cathy. There's a question from Michael Weems that I think I've certainly heard a lot from my peers who I've talked to about privilege. He says, when I hear the phrase check your privilege, I feel like I'm being called out as being a sexist. What can feminists do to combat this? I suppose what he means is what does this phrase really mean, and how can we as feminists make it clear that asking someone to check their privilege is not necessarily telling them that they're a bad person, but just to be aware of certain things that they're endowed with that shelters them, as you said, from certain types of discrimination.
Right, right. So I think that if someone's telling you to check your privilege, then they clearly don't feel listened to. They don't feel like their unique experience is being valued by you at the time. And I think this is an issue that libertarians need to take very seriously, because we are, the data has shown, particularly privileged. If you believe in the idea of privilege at all, if you believe that all else being equal, you know, a rich, well-educated white man has it easier than a poor, transgendered, you know, black woman, then we need to make it clear that we're aware of that and that we're concerned. Because if we're just a movement by and for privileged people who won't acknowledge our privilege, that's all we're ever going to be, you know. And if that's okay with you, that's unfortunate. but it's not okay with me. I want to be a movement that encompasses all kinds of people. And if we're going to be that, we need to learn how to talk to them. And the first step of that is realizing they know things we don't know. They have experiences we don't have. And so if they don't understand that we understand that, it's going to be a lot harder to start that dialogue and to have any kind of useful exchange. And so I think the first step is just to recognize it, just to admit it, to say, you know things I don't know, and I want to learn. And, you know, people who feel like they're being listened to and people who feel like they're teaching are a lot more open to listening themselves.
Great. I hope that answered your question, Michael. And if you want to follow up, feel free to. I've got a question from Juliana. Feminism is often associated with socialism. Why do you think this came about, and how do we as libertarians combat these ideas?
That's interesting. I will admit my own ignorance of history. I don't know exactly why that happened. I think it's because in political discourse, at least in America, it's been supposed free marketers against supposed collectivists. And supposed free marketers, I don't know if it's been kind of a religious thing or what, have seemed to either be openly hostile to women's liberation because of the threat that it posed to the traditional family, or to ignore it. Whereas collectivists have been very sympathetic to the cause of women's liberation and have successfully co-opted the cause to further their goals. And so I think going forward, people who are not collectivists, if we're going to have any hope at all, we need to take the goals of and the concerns of women's liberation very seriously. We need to not just be sympathetic to them, but to not tolerate hostility to women's liberation in our own circles. Or women's liberation, it's not going to stop, but it'll continue to be associated with collectivism, which I think would be a terrible blow, not just for women's liberation, but for economic freedom.
All right, I got a great question from, I apologize if I pronounce your name wrong, Sadullah Bashir. She says, do you think the reason that libertarians, male and female, are prone to be hostile to feminism and female issues is because a large majority of them come to libertarianism from a conservative Christian background? If that is true, which she thinks it is, how much effort should be invested in trying to make common cause broadly as opposed to on specific issues with conservatives?
I think it is. I think it is true. I think that's exactly right. I think that it's worthwhile to unalign ourselves with the portions of the population which would seek to derail women's progress, and to align with the portions of the population who would seek to see women no longer discriminated against and no longer held back because women are advancing. If we're only appealing to married women who are fine with gendered expectations and fine with kind of subtle sexism and are, you know, not super concerned with rape culture, that's becoming a smaller and smaller portion of the population. So on a pure numbers basis, I think it would be a huge mistake to go ahead and let collectivists be the only ones that those kinds of women and men are able to align with.
All right. I have a question from Eric Ansel, who asks something that is definitely a very hot topic, especially for the more Democrat-leaning feminist crowd. He asks, what are some possible, I presume, more libertarian-based solutions to gender wage discrimination?
I think gendered expectations is the biggest source of the wage gap. I think, so the conversation usually goes, the wage gap persists. And then free marketers say, well, it's the result of women's choices, and they leave it there. But they don't look at the second shift, that women in America today are the women who work full-time jobs and have full-time employed husbands, then do more housework and more child rearing than their husbands do. So and it's called the second shift. And they do that because they're expected to, because they don't question it, because that's the way it works. And so if we can look at that situation, we can look at those expectations and ignore them and just say, well, you know, oh, the wage gap is the result of free choices. That's all I need to know. I mean, that's not good enough. It's not good enough for feminists. It's not good enough for women. It's not good enough for anyone. And so we need to get involved in basically an education situation where we say, well, women's earning potential is higher than it's ever been. Because we're in an economy that values education and service, which women are culturally best suited to, you know, what can we do to help women realize their full potential in this economy? Because it's not just good for women. If women can make decisions about what's best for them on the ground, if they can figure out where their highest value is individually and not as a result of cultured expectations, we're going to be a richer and more prosperous society. I mean, it's best for everyone. So cultured expectations should be an issue, a very serious issue, for anyone who believes in the value of innovation and anyone who wants to see a more prosperous world.
I think I've got a comment that addresses that very well from Rachel Davison, who says, the fundamental humility of the market, the recognition of local knowledge, and the value of individual preference should be extended to our interaction. In the same way, we know that each individual knows what is best for them. We should respect their individual reasons and engage them from a position of humility. I think that really ties into what you were just saying.
Beautiful.
Let's see. Here's another hot button question. Meredith Miller says that a feminist topic that libertarians don't seem to agree on is abortion. What is a good way for libertarians to address this topic and still appeal to feminists?
That's hard. That's super hard. I think from a position of humility, I think that there are kind of two ways to look at abortion. You are, I think, possibly justified in saying that a fetus is a human life which deserves protection. And you're justified in saying restrictions on abortion cause women who want them serious harm because they're going to continue to get them, but they're going to get them in an unsafe manner. There's a Gutenmacher, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, study that shows that they've actually demonstrated that in countries with greater restrictions on abortion, you have more women who are maimed and killed trying to get them. So we need to be serious about, okay, if we believe that fetuses are worthy of protection and we think that it's worth ending women's lives early to protect them, okay, but we need to be honest about it. And so one of the problems with the current pro-life movement is that they're not honest about it. They act like abortion will go away if it's outlawed, and we as libertarians know that prohibition doesn't work, so we need to just be honest about it. For people who don't believe that abortion ends human life or don't believe that fetuses deserve that kind of protection, you're not going to win them over, but you can at least be honest. So that's my kind of take on it.
And if I might make a comment on the subject, I think that abortion is not typically considered by people who want to have it as a first choice, and that by allowing greater access to education and measures that would perhaps prevent the need for abortion, we might be able to avoid the issue almost altogether. But it doesn't seem like that is an object of concern for many of the conservative pro-life crowd.
Right. I mean, if we're marketers, do we believe in the market or not? Because if you do, instead of picking up a picket sign, buy birth control for someone. I mean, it's not that expensive. If every pro-lifer donated $100 a year to providing birth control for women, we could put a serious dent in the demand for abortion. So, put your money where your mouth is.
All right, I hope that answered your question, Meredith. I've got another question. Well, let's see. I'll try and vary things up a little bit. Let's see. Christopher Sapienza says, if we assume that immigrants will help with domestic services, as you say, Won't this become a self-fulfilling prophecy and prevent them from acquiring and pursuing high-powered careers in the same way that assuming women are in charge of the house may very well have the effect of holding them back from high-powered careers?
I don't think it's an assumption to say that the majority of immigrants in a free immigration system would happen to be low skill, low English, low education people, because that makes up the majority of the world right now. And so they would tend to be more likely to be housekeepers and engineers. I don't think that's like an expectation problem. I think that's kind of just an education and economic reality. So I don't really, yeah.
Let's see. I've got a question from the lovely Barbara Sostaita. Barbie says, Cathy, someone asked if libertarians' conservative Christian backgrounds can be attributed to the rejection of feminism. Is there a role Christianity and religion can play in embracing feminism?
Yes. I'm reading a really awesome book right now called Jesus Feminist, and the author actually lays out what an amazing feminist Jesus actually is/was. I think absolutely that Christianity and feminism can play along very nicely. It has played along nicely in certain aspects, in certain ways in the past, and that it's primarily a culture problem that it's not right now fulfilling the promise that it has. So absolutely, I would highly recommend that book. If I find others, I'll recommend those as well, but that's what I'm reading right now.
Excellent. I've got a question, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, from Batuhan Avocado, who says, is to oppose the gender roles which are dictated by the society and to be a feminist sort of the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think feminism encompasses a little more than a rejection of gender roles, but I think that, and when I say rejecting gender roles, obviously it's more nuanced than that, but thinking critically about the impact gender roles, gendered expectations, manifest in gender roles has on society, it's a feminist action. And, you know, if that's all you do, you're doing good things. That's a good way to be a good feminist, is just to start questioning and thinking critically and pushing back.
I have a question from, where did it go? I can't find it. From Yvonne Mielis. I'm sorry, I probably butchered that. What do you think about the situation of women in Latin America? I don't have any more elaboration on the question, but it's one of the last ones that hasn't been answered.
Well, I don't know that much about it, unfortunately. I know in Chile, both the candidates for president are women. That's pretty cool. I know there's a huge fight for abortion access in Latin America, but beyond that, I'm not super well informed. If you guys have any good sources of information for me, I'd love to have them. I don't know, unfortunately.
I have a question for you. I'm sort of stealing it from someone who asked it at the recent Carolina Regional Conference, but do you think that the typical libertarian rejection of the idea of identity politics is a barrier to embracing not only feminists and women into the liberty movement, but also other groups into the movement? And if that's sort of keeping the libertarian movement to a primarily white male movement?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking this. I think this is really, really important. I see a lot of usually white male, sometimes white female libertarians decry identity politics. And I get it. I understand. There is the fact that if you tell someone that they're disadvantaged, for example, the women, the little girls who were reminded that little girls are worse at math. There was another example where they weren't reminded that they were biologically predetermined to do poorly, but they were reminded that they were discriminated against, and then they also performed worse because they expected to be discriminated against. Of course, that's a problem, and we don't want a bunch of victims, and we don't want to encourage a culture of victimization, and we surely don't want the solutions to problems that identity politics are associated with, right? We don't want laws which mandate that women have to be paid a certain amount. We're very wary of affirmative action sometimes. We fight for businesses' ability to hire who they want at the rate that they want to pay them. Understood, completely understood. These are all legitimate ways to feel and legitimate criticisms of identity politics. However, people who are not rich, straight, white men, they are into identity politics. They identify with certain subgroups, and they're interested in the welfare of those subgroups. And if we want to call it identity politics, we can. Otherwise, we're just calling it people want what's best for themselves and their families. And if we're not interested in the unique challenges that those groups face, if we're not interested in the barriers to entry that they're still having to deal with, that we don't know about because we're not facing those same barriers, if we're not listening to them about those barriers, and if we're not actively interested in making life better for them, we're just going to continue working in opposition to each other. And that's problematic. And so I get it, you know, maybe we can come up with a better term than identity politics, but the fact of the matter is people have identities, and they're interested in the welfare of those identities, and they're interested in the challenges that those identities face. And so we need to get serious about meeting people where they are instead of telling them how they should be.
That is a beautifully eloquent answer. And I have just gotten a question that I think goes back on that subject from Lindsay Jackson that says, is there a better way of addressing privilege outside of saying the phrase, check your privilege? The reason that she asks this is that check your privilege often comes across as an assumption on the lack of struggles a person has based on race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, etc. And I wondered if you wanted to address her concerns about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you want to talk it in amongst your group about the unique struggles of, you know, the Ben Folds song, it's hard to be a white boy in the suburbs, like, do that and have a good time. But yeah, I mean, of course we all face struggles, and of course life isn't easy for anyone. And it sucks to have somebody sit there and tell you, oh, because you're a white man, life's been easy for you, when you know it hasn't, you know, when you know the things that you've gone through. But if you want to talk to people who don't share your identity, saying to them, well, no, I mean, life hasn't been easy for me either, that's not really gonna get you anywhere. It's not. It's a no-go. Yeah, just be aware of that. I mean, yes, of course, people who are of different identities should be aware that nobody has a get through life easy card, right? It's just levels, and it's just different kinds. It's different struggles, and we all have them, and that's important to be aware of. But trying to get someone who is of a different identity to commiserate with your struggles shouldn't be your goal, right? How does that help liberty? For someone to understand how hard you've had it? It doesn't. What helps liberty is for you to show them that you care about them, for you to show them that liberty is best for them in this way, and that you're interested in it because it's best for them, not because it's best for you.
And I think another, to go off that, something that a lot of people mistake in discussions of privilege is that being privileged does not mean at all that you personally have had it easy. There are plenty of people who have certain privileges based on their race or their gender or whatever that have not had easy lives. And to be privileged is not to have had an easy life or to have gone through life without individual struggles, but it just means that there are certain types of struggles that you would be isolated from as a person with certain privileges.
Perfect.
I've got another question from Christopher Sapienza, who says, if we believe in the market, then wouldn't we believe that wage differences for equally productive persons be bid away via competition? Might the wage gap be due to an uncompetitive market as opposed to sexism?
Yes. I mean, that's part of it. Yeah, we do not have a market that's anywhere near competitive enough. There's a huge problem with cronyism, which blunts the effects of competition. And I mean, think about it. Who are the cronies? They're the people who have made it to the ranks of CEO up until this point, ranks that have until pretty recently been pretty closed off to women. So you have a bunch of rich white businessmen making sure that their businesses are insulated from competition by using the regulatory process. That's a feminist issue, right? And it's a feminist issue we can deal with in a completely voluntary and completely cooperative way by limiting regulations, by saying, no, everyone should have to compete on the same terms. Being an incumbent should give you no advantage via the state, but right now it does. But, right, and so if we said that, if we said, we're interested in ending cronyism because we want to give female entrepreneurs and male entrepreneurs all the, not advantage, but the chance that they deserve to compete in the marketplace, because we care about women. Like that would be a huge improvement over what we have now. But also, it's still not sufficient. We still have those gendered expectations and holdovers in our culture that we still need to address, and that's where, you know, a more thick libertarianism can join together with the thin libertarianism and work together to create a society where opportunity really is equal.
Excellent. I've got another question from Sadullah Bashir. He says, would you recommend that libertarians take courses in or read literature from feminist theory, gender studies, race studies, etc., as a means of better understanding what the non-white, non-male, non-straight side thinks?
Absolutely. I think it's a huge show of respect. So I think that listening is great. I don't think you have to. I don't think you need to come to a conversation with someone with a different identity than yours, you know, being read up on their terms if you're listening. But if you're listening and you're informed, if you're listening to them and to their intellectual tradition, I think that that would be wonderful. And it's fascinating. It's just interesting. I think the first step of reaching out is not to talk but to listen, and to get educated about the intellectual tradition is a great way to get started.
I've got just a little question for you. You mentioned a lot how advancing the causes of feminism help not only women but also help men, things such as breaking down gender stereotypes and whatnot. Could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So what's really fascinating, I want to talk about first MRAs and then I want to talk about marriage. I'm saying that so I'll remember. So a lot of the legitimate concerns of men's rights activists are concerns shared by feminists. So for example, a lot of the problems with child support, alimony, divorce, custody, those are very serious problems where men are hurt by the criminal justice system and discriminated against. But they're feminist concerns because they deal with gender roles. They deal with the assumption that women are dependent on men. They deal with the assumption that women have a different or a closer relationship with their kids than men do, that women should be primary caretakers. Those are feminist issues. So I think that men are absolutely benefited by working with feminists to break down gendered expectations because it benefits them as well. The second way that breaking down gendered expectations help men is there have been several studies or surveys which have come out saying that men are very interested in getting married and having relationships, but they're having trouble doing so because of the gendered expectation that a man works to support his wife. And so men are having trouble, especially, again, low-income, low-education men, finding wives because women who are better educated and earn more don't want to marry them. But these men, if marriage were not kind of controlled by, if the marriage market weren't so impacted by these gendered expectations, then men and women could better find organizations, divisions of labor, roles which fit them as individuals better than roles based on their gender. Same with men who are perfectly happy to be Mr. Dad, who are perfectly happy, supporting a working life by dealing with things at home, but who then have to deal with discrimination and mocking and cultural problems. Those men would be very much benefited by a questioning of kind of what we consider traditional gender roles.
Excellent. I hope that was my question. Okay, I know I'm just like reading canned answers out of my head. I have a question from Shaolin Zhang, who I'm going to try and ask what I think this question is asking. Shaolin says, by definition, libertarianism holds that the role an individual plays is a decision for the individual to make. So if there is a so-called expectation for women to play a certain role, it should be from a libertarian standpoint. Should women reject these expectations by themselves first if they don't want to meet it, rather than relying, I assume this person's asking, rather than relying on culture to break down those barriers first?
That's interesting. That gets to kind of a debate within feminism of whether women have a duty to other women, to the movement, to the culture, to not conform to gendered expectations. Should change start with you? And I'm far too much of an individualist to advocate for that. I think that, you need to make decisions that will maximize your own self-interest with the circumstances you find yourself in. So if you want to be a stay-at-home mother, or you want to be a stripper, or whatever it is that's going to maximize your self-interest, I think you don't owe anyone anything except yourself, and so do it. But that doesn't take you out of the runnings, right? You can be a cultural critic while you stay home and bake cookies and while you're on the pole, right? You can still participate in the conversation. You can still think critically. You can still say, hey, I've made my decisions, but I didn't make them in a vacuum, and I want the next generation of women to make decisions in a more free society than I did.
Great. I hope that answered your question. I'm looking for if there's anything that I haven't gotten to. I have asked a couple people to follow up on some of the comments they made and see if they could be made into more question-like statements.
Well, I think we're about out of time, but I just wanted to say I am absolutely available if people want to continue these conversations. I obviously love to have them. Is it okay if I just go ahead and kind of say where people can reach me?
Sure, that would be great.
Okay, awesome. So I'm on Twitter. It's at Cathy Reisenwitz, CathyReisenwitz. I am on Facebook, facebook.com/Cathy Reisenwitz. And my blog, again, is sexandthestate.com. So I've got a contact form there. You can tweet at me. You can Facebook me. If you have any more questions or you think of anything, I'd love to hear from you. I want to just, again, thank everybody so much for attending, for being interested in this topic, for the amazing questions. This was really high quality discussion, I felt like. I want to thank SFL again for hosting me. Zoe, thank you so much for handling the Q&A and introducing me, putting your own questions in there. They were really great. And yeah, let's keep this conversation going.
Cathy, thank you so much. I hope you all had a very enriching experience tonight. I know I did. And Cathy, it's always great to hear from you. And please, everybody go to sexandthestate.com. It's one of my favorite blogs. It's awesome. And I guess without further ado, we will say goodbye tonight. Bye, Cathy. Thank you so much. And bye, all of you webinar participants. Thanks for coming.